you, Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and guests. Many of you have heard me talk about the novel that I wrote and published about Blessed Thomas Abel. And as Nancy was saying, next month I will be traveling to London to visit some of the places mentioned in the book. I plan to record video at the Tower of London, Hampton Court, Oxford, and even Smithfield to create a mini documentary. So today I want to give you a sneak peek at the documentary's content with a recap of the story for those of you who haven't heard it before as I prepare for the trip and the film. Thomas's story is a little known footnote in history. To understand who he was, we have to take a step back in time to the Tudor period in England. Now, Thomas Abel was a priest, but he was not just any ordinary priest. He was Catherine of Aragon's personal chaplain. And like many people in England during his time, he disapproved of King Henry VIII's attempts to divorce his wife. But unlike most other people in England, he couldn't just be cheeky about it. He could not simply ignore it because as the Queen's priest, he met with Queen Catherine nearly every day. He listened to her pain. He felt her pain. He knew her fears and her prayers. And he knew that what the king was trying to do was unjust. And so he spoke up. And eventually, as you can imagine, because we're talking about Tudor England, he was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Now, Thomas possibly would have been forgotten in history, except that he also carved his name and family emblem in the Beauchamp Tower in the Tower of London. Now, thousands of people walk past this very inscription every day, and some of them pause and read the plaque, but many of them just move on. And very few people know Thomas's story, but I would like to change that. So, who was Thomas Abel? Well, I can tell you one thing. He didn't start out in the royal court. He was, as I said earlier, a priest. And he started out as an Oxford academic. So he probably lived a quiet life in one of Europe's greatest centers of learning. As a scholar, he would have been aware of the ideas spreading across Europe. He would have known, for instance, about Martin Luther in Germany, and perhaps even William Tyndale, who translated the Bible into English. I like to imagine Thomas Abel and William Tyndale as students together at Oxford, hanging out in the pub, the Old Bear, or maybe going for a walk down a street like this, and just getting to know each other and discussing the great questions of the day. Maybe they asked, should the Bible be available in English for anyone to read? Or what should the role of the church be in politics? It was probably a life of study and conversation and perhaps caring for the needs of other Oxford students. It was quiet, maybe even safe. But then everything changed. So, meanwhile, back in London, while Thomas was enjoying this quiet academic life, a storm was building. King Henry VIII was beginning to think that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been a giant mistake. The two had been married for nearly 20 years, although they didn't have any sons, and there was no one to succeed the king when he died. Now, to be fair, Queen Catherine had had 6 children, but only one of them had died, a daughter named Mary, and for King Henry VIII, that simply wasn't enough. So he began to build a case to end his marriage, specifically to get it annulled, basically to say that it never existed. So he began appealing to the Pope and surrounding himself with advisors who would support his cause. And he even replaced the household staff with English-speaking servants who could report back to him, essentially spying on the Queen. And that is where Thomas Abel came in. Now, the king's right-hand man, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, invited Thomas Abel to serve the Queen. And suddenly, like it or not, Thomas found himself at the center of the royal court. Now, we don't really have a record of how he felt about spying on the Queen, but we do know that after a few years of service, King Henry VIII sent him on a special mission to Spain, which was the Queen's homeland, to retrieve a single document. Now, you might think this is a bit odd, traveling over land and sea to bring back a single document, but this piece of paper was incredibly valuable. This was a letter about 20 years old, that a letter to Catherine's mother from the Pope, that essentially proved that the Pope had always supported Catherine and Henry's marriage. It basically completely undermined King Henry VIII's argument that the Pope had granted permission for the marriage without the relevant facts. In fact, Thomas realized that the only reason King Henry wanted the document in England was to make it disappear. And Thomas must have known this, because when he got to Spain, he basically went off script. He asked Emperor Charles V to keep this important document, this piece of evidence, in Spain. And he also told the emperor that the king's case against his aunt, Catherine, was unjust, and a way to deprive her of her title and authority. Thomas also wrote a book, anonymously, of course, explaining all of his logic and reason for opposing the king's divorce. The actual book is right here behind me. But as you can imagine, in Tudor England, this did not stay a secret either. And Thomas was eventually arrested and taken to the Tower of London, where he spent 7 years alone. And on July 31st, 1540, after 7 years of solitude, Thomas was executed as a traitor. As I was researching Thomas Abell's life, one question kept coming back to me. Why? Why would a man risk everything? His position, his freedom, his life? Why stand up against a king? Why remain faithful when it would cost him everything? History can tell us facts, but it can't always give us reason. So I kept on researching. I stepped back into his world, and through a lot of research and a little bit of imagination, I wrote The Queen's Priest, the story of Blessed Thomas Abell. Now, if you would like more information about the book or the story behind the book, you can now go to my new website, thequeenspriest.com. And the book is also available as a paperback, ebook, or audiobook on Amazon. Thank you for allowing me to share today about Thomas Abell and my upcoming trip. Thank you, Madam Toastmaster.